Forged or pseudepigrapha equals the same thing. Do you know the difference? Pseudepigrapha is just a fancy word for forged. And before we even start really unpacking Christianity itself, you're going to hear that, not from one, not two, but three Christian scholars and an atheist. This foundation matters, because once you realize how much of the so-called sacred is built on forgeries, the whole house starts to shake. Part 1. Did you know the Gospels were forged? So what does one of the top minds in New Testament scholarship have to say? Not a fringe critic, but a leading authority. Let's hear it straight from the source. Are there any forgeries inside the New Testament? My contention in this book that I've just written, Forged, is that in fact there are books of this sort in the New Testament books that claim to be written by apostles that were not written by those apostles. To give you just a couple of examples, I've already indicated that writing books in the name of Peter was a wide practice. It was widely practiced even in earlier times. In the New Testament, there are two books that claim to be written by Peter, 1 Peter and 2 Peter. Scholars are virtually unified with the exception of fundamentalists and very conservative evangelicals. Everybody else agrees that whoever wrote 2 Peter, it was not the author of 1 Peter. They have completely different writing styles, which if you read them in Greek, they are as different as if you read Mark Twain and T.S. Eliot. They are very different writing styles. Moreover, almost everybody agrees the 2 Peter was not written by Peter. What about 1 Peter? I don't think Peter wrote 1 Peter or 2 Peter. And the reason I don't think he wrote 1 Peter or 2 Peter, because I don't think Peter could write. What do we know about Peter? Well, in the New Testament, he's a fisherman in rural Galilee. Were fishermen in rural Galilee educated? The answer is almost certainly no. The ancient world that indicate that at the best of times in the ancient world, maybe 10% of the population could read. Far fewer than that 10% could write. And by write, I mean copy out letters. Fewer than that could compose, and fewer than that could compose something that was very elegant. 1 Peter is written in highly elegant Greek. Professor Bart Ehrman, 1 million Bible contradictions. Peter wasn't educated. Acts 4:13 flat out says it. He was unschooled and ordinary. So no, he didn't sit down and write polished Greek epistles. That's not speculation. That's straight from the text. The evidence doesn't suggest illiteracy. It declares it. Acts 4:13. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. Maybe he dictated it, and a scribe wrote it down. Maybe a secretary produced it for him. I try to show in my book is that it didn't work that way in the ancient world. This idea that you could have secretaries write books for you, there is no basis for it in the evidence that survives from antiquity at all. Professor Bart Ehrman, 1 million Bible contradictions. Pseudepigraphal critic Dr. Daniel Wallace does not agree with Dr. Bart Ehrman's stance. Wallace states, how did the ancient church view forgeries? If they discovered that a book was not written by the person who claimed to write it, that was attributed to it, they would always throw it out. That book is to be rejected. It doesn't matter if it's squeaky clean orthodox, agrees with the Westminster Confession of Faith, or Viola's doctrinal statement. It didn't matter. The fact is that that book was not part of Scripture. Dr. Daniel Wallace. Why pseudepigrapha books were not included in New Testament Scripture? This claim is flat out false. We don't know who wrote the Gospels. The names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are later Catholic attributions, not historical facts. What we do know is that the real authors were not those four. How? Because life expectancy in Jesus' time was 35-40 years, and the earliest Gospel, Mark, wasn't written until the 70s CE, decades after Jesus died. John came even later, into the 2nd century. Matthew and Luke both rely heavily on Mark, and both used the lost Q source. Why would an eyewitness apostle copy a second-hand account like Mark's? And Luke can't be Paul's companion either. Acts contradicts Paul's own letters repeatedly. As for John, nearly all scholars agree it wasn't one person but a community, writing between 90 and 110 CE. This completely destroys Dr. Wallace's argument without even addressing the contested letter of Paul, which will be covered later in this video. But what happens when Dr. Ehrman takes this case directly to a conservative scholar? In a 2010 public debate titled "Was the New Testament Forged?", Dr. Ehrman squared off against Dr. Darrell Bach, a leading evangelical scholar from Dallas Theological Seminary. Bach pushes back, not with new evidence, but with a redefinition of terms. According to him, it's not really forgery unless it's done with malicious intent. Dr. Darrell Bach, we're dealing with ancient literary conventions that were different from our modern assumptions. Sometimes writing in the name of a teacher was seen as honorable, part of preserving tradition. Ehrman wasn't having it. Dr. Bart Ehrman. That's simply not how it worked in early Christian circles. The church fathers condemned such writings when they were exposed. They called them false, pseudos, and rejected them as forgeries. In other words, Bach argues for an ancient exception. Ehrman shows that early Christian leaders didn't make one. Here's the twist. Both Dr. Wallace and Dr. Bach teach at Dallas Theological Seminary, but they can't seem to agree on one key point. Wallace claims that the early church always rejected pseudonymous works, full stop. If it wasn't written by the name on the label, it didn't make it into the Bible as we saw earlier. But Bach takes a softer approach. In his debate with Ehrman, he suggests pseudonymous writing might have been a legitimate literary custom, not forgery, just disciples honoring their teachers, as stated moments ago. So which is it? Either the early church was uncompromising and rejected all pseudepigraphy, or it tolerated it under certain conditions. They can't both be right. To punch home the point before moving on, Professor Dale Martin of Yale University, in his New Testament lecture, From Stories to Canon, states, "Why is this text scripture? Why is it canon?" And most Christians will say, because it is inspired. That's not what the ancients believed. They believed that there were lots of texts that were inspired, and there were different levels of inspiration. So just because a text is inspired, or even if you believe it's inspired by God and that God told somebody to write it, that wasn't enough for ancient Christians to include it in their Bible, in their canon. So inspiration, contrary to modern assumptions, was not the criteria you hear ancient people talk about. Apostolic authorship was one thing they talk about. So, for example, Papias and other ancient writers, they said, well, we accept the Gospel of Mark because, well, if it wasn't written by an apostle, it was written by someone very close to an apostle. And it was Peter's gospel that Mark just published, or Luke published Paul's gospel. So often, some people in the ancient world, if there was a gospel they didn't like, they didn't want it to be included, they would argue against it being authored by an apostle. So that at least they claimed for some that through these texts that they wanted apostolic authorship, or close to apostolic authorship. The problem was, we can tell historically that these texts were not written by apostles, nor do we believe they were written even by the close disciples of apostles. They're anonymous texts. So if that was the reason they were included in the ancient world, it's not the reason they're still in now, because modern scholars don't believe the apostles actually wrote all of these texts in the New Testament. Once again, this completely dismantles Dr. Daniel Wallace's claim. Eusebius, the father of church history, confirmed it. He divided Christian texts into recognized, disputed, and forgeries. He named books that were falsely attributed to apostles and explicitly rejected them. But here's the problem. Some of those disputed books still made it into the Bible. Part 2. Eusebius, father of church history. Eusebius of Caesarea was a 4th century bishop and played a crucial role in the debate over pseudepigraphical works. His writings show that the early church did, in fact, struggle with forged texts, and he provides clear evidence that pseudepigraphy was not universally accepted. In his landmark work, Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 25, Eusebius divides early Christian writings into 3 categories: recognized, homologomena, universally accepted books, e.g. the 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters; disputed, antilegomena, books accepted by some but questioned by others, e.g. James, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, Revelation; spurious, notha, books considered false or forged, e.g. Acts of Paul, Gospel of Peter, Apocalypse of Peter, Shepherd of Hermas, etc. Eusebius uses the term notha, meaning illegitimate or counterfeit. Among the spurious must be numbered the Acts of Paul, the so-called Shepherd, the Apocalypse of Peter, and in addition to these, the Gospel of Peter. All these have been rejected. Ecclesiastical History 3.25. This directly refutes Daniel Wallace's claim that pseudonymous books were always rejected before canonization. In fact, Eusebius admits some were read widely in churches for a time despite doubts about their authorship. Eusebius includes 2 Peter in the disputed category, saying, "One epistle of Peter, which is called the first, is acknowledged. The second, which we have received, is contested." That means even in the 4th century, the church wasn't sure Peter wrote 2 Peter. This is devastating for anyone claiming that apostolic authorship was required for inclusion in the canon, because 2 Peter made it in, even while its authorship was doubted. Some defenders of traditional authorship, like Ron Jones of the Titus Institute, argue that the early church unanimously affirmed that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. He points to early figures like Papias, Justin Martyr, and Irenaeus, who named these 4 authors explicitly by the 2nd century. Jones also emphasizes that no early church father denies these attributions, and that harmonizations like Tatian's Diatessaron show the fourfold gospel was well established by 170 CE. But this argument leans heavily on tradition and late sources. Critics point out that the gospels themselves are anonymous, none claim authorship internally, and that names were likely assigned decades later to lend apostolic authority. Even Papias's statements are second-hand and vague, with scholars questioning how much they can really tell us about the final form of the texts. In short, early church fathers do provide testimony, but it's far from airtight proof, and modern critical scholarship paints a much more complicated picture. Eusebius tells us, "The Church of Ephesus also holds the tradition that John the Apostle and Evangelist lived among them and was buried there." Ecclesiastical History 3.313. Eusebius supports the tradition that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the 4th Gospel, but again, this is based on later church tradition, not direct evidence from the text itself. Part 4. The Contested Letters of Paul. The contested or disputed letters of Paul are those New Testament epistles that the vast majority of critical scholars firmly conclude were not actually written by Paul, despite bearing his name. We will see Dr. Wallace attempt to defend these letters in the same way he defends the Gospels, claiming Pauline authorship, but soon we will expose exactly how flawed and untenable his position truly is. Sointhes century, there was a letter that was discovered called Paul's letter to the Laodiceans. So what it was a pastiche from 4 different letters that Paul wrote, and in the doctorate program at Dallas Seminary, when I we goover that letter, we actually translate it in class and discuss why this should not be part of the canon. It's completely orthodox. It's quotations from 4 of Paul's letters, but it's not written by Paul. It was written in the 2nd century, so it did not go into the canon. Dr. Wallace, why Pseudepigrapha books were not included in New Testament scripture. Dr. Ehrman rebuttals with, "There are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul in the New Testament. Scholars talk about the 7 undisputed Pauline epistles because 6 of these letters were probably not written by Paul. Now, in this case, we have a way of evaluating whether Paul wrote a specific letter. If you've got 7 letters that you're pretty sure somebody wrote, and you've got another letter you're not sure about, you can compare it to the 7, which is what scholars do. They take the letters of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus and Colossians and Ephesians and 2nd, and they compared them with the 7 undisputed letters. And in every case, there are wide-ranging differences in writing style, in theology, in presupposed historical situation, in a number of ways that make it pretty clear whoever wrote the book of 1 Timothy, it wasn't Paul. And the same for the other 6. If you add up the numbers, the way it works is this: there are a number of books in the New Testament that are anonymous. What are the disputed letters of Paul? 1. Ephesians, different vocabulary and a more developed theology, likely written after Paul's death. 2. Colossians, similar issues as Ephesians, language and theology don't align with the undisputed letters. 3. 2 Thessalonians, its tone and eschatology, view of the end times, differ from 1 Thessalonians. 4. 1 Timothy. 5. 2 Timothy. 6. Titus. These 3 are called the pastoral epistles and are heavily disputed. Also, Hebrews is not a letter of Paul, and almost no modern scholar thinks it ever was. The author includes himself among second-generation believers, Hebrews 2:3, implying he didn't know Jesus personally. Paul claimed direct revelation, which is our biggest red flag. So if, as Dr. Wallace claims, pseudepigraphal letters attributed to Paul weren't included in the New Testament, then how do we explain the 6 forgeries that are in there under Paul's name? And why did theologians for centuries treat Hebrews as Pauline if authorship was so clear? Either the early church couldn't tell or didn't care. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical.